The Mood With No Name is held at the Devereux pub in London. Check out their website for details of future talks. The following talk is by Tim Heath about William Blake. Tim Heath is the head honcho at the Blake Society, and more details about them can be found at theblakesociety.org.
Since the last meeting, of course, incredible news. As many of you may remember, on the Midsummer Sunrise in 1984 was the last time before the long ban that there was a festival at Stonehenge. And on that particular day as well, Prince William was born. And yesterday, when his son was born, Stonehenge was struck by lightning. Now, if that isn't clear proof that this child is the Antichrist, I don't know what there might be. I was hoping to carry forward a joke into this intro, but apparently that the child has now been named, and it's going to be George. So they'll call it G bit. George Alexander
Louis
Windsor.
Cambridge.
Oh, Cambridge. Named after a car. Those of you who remember Steve Grasso's talk here, well, I wasn't actually here, but for reasons just explained, who's an expert on voodoo. He was actually starting a campaign that the child should be named something which reminds modern people who are fascinated by the doings of royalty, and that he should be named Joffrey. Now, whether those people who don't get that will be explained to you later. That was exactly our reaction when we saw his tweet. Tonight's speaker, he's not William Blake. Tonight's speaker is Tim Heath, who is the chair of the William Blake Society. We've been wanting to have a talk on Blake for an awful long time, and as you can guess, we've obviously got the right expert tonight. So I can have a huge round of applause, please, for Tim Heath.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk tonight about one aspect of William Blake. Next slide. Okay. Psychonaut is a term which is a compound word of naut as in aeronaut or astronaut, and psych as in psychiatry or psychology or psychic. So a psychonaut is a person who travels into the psyche. And William Blake was such a person. And he used three types of device to travel. He was an artist, he was a poet, and he was a prophet. You're looking on the screen, it's a map, a diagram by Lida Cardozo. Lida Cardozo is a letter cutter from Cambridge, and the Blake Society have commissioned her to make a new gravestone for William Blake. As many of you will know, William Blake is buried in Bunhill Fields, the dissenters' burial ground on the edge of the city. The gravestone at the moment has two problems with it. One, it's not in the right place, and secondly, it's not the original stone. Blake was buried in an unmarked grave. We know the exact location of Blake's grave because it was recorded with coordinates. He's buried in the position 2277-9. 2277 gives the east-west coordinates, and 9 gives the depth in the ground. He's buried with 8 people. There are 4 below and 3 above. So we've commissioned a gravestone for William Blake, and on it says William Blake and his years of life 1757 to to 1827, and the short description of who he is: a poet, an artist, and a prophet. And it is that word prophet which I'd like to talk to you about tonight. It's a word which is a little bit out of favour. When you meet people at a party, they may be accountants or lawyers or juries, but it's rare to meet someone who introduces themselves as a prophet. Quite a brave thing to do, but still quite unusual. But this audience is not one I've encountered before, so maybe all of you are prophets. The final thing about this is on the gravestone, which is actually a flat horizontal stone, which is called a ledger stone. There is a line from Blake's great work, Jerusalem. I give you the end of a golden stream. Only wind it in, and it shall bring you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. So most people know William Blake as a cultural figure. He is really central to our culture in an establishment sense. So, outside the British Library at King's Cross, when they built it, they commissioned Paolozzi, who was a friend of the architect, to produce a giant sculpture, something that was appropriate to the British Library. And so Paolozzi drew on this cascade of references. Paolozzi being a sculptor, he took an image that William Blake had painted of Isaac Newton. So we have this cascade of Paolozzi to Blake to Newton. And this is William Blake's image of Newton. He portrays Newton at the bottom of the ocean. He's underwater. Blake's eccentricity you'll discover a little bit more about tonight. Blake was concerned with science. He was concerned with how reason had become dominant among many of his friends and among the culture. And Newton was the principal figure that one could identify science and in particular reason with. William Blake still inspires artists today. And although the Blake Society is making a gravestone in Bunker Fields, there are some other wonderful memorials to William Blake. And this one is in Gateshead at the Baltic Centre. And it was commissioned from the Catalan artist, Plenfa. And what it consists of is a laser. And at night, occasionally, the laser is turned on. And it goes something like 1,000 meters into the night sky. And I think partly what Plenfa was trying to suggest was how William Blake links this earth to some form of heaven. Blake continues to be a great inspiration across the arts, across music, literature. In terms of music, his lyrics have inspired thousands of musical settings. So I'm going to talk about this one aspect, prophecy. Blake as a prophet. It was something that was really important to him in his lifetime. So for example, one of his most important books was called Milton, William Blake's Milton. And at the beginning of Milton, there is the famous lyric which is the hymn Jerusalem, and did those feet. And immediately after the poem Jerusalem, he puts this quotation, which comes from the Bible, which is a source of so much of the discussion about prophecy. And the quotation is from the book of Numbers. And it says, "Would to God that all the Lord's people were prophets." So the centrality of prophecy to Blake is paramount. He was an avid reader. He would read all sorts of books. And he would also annotate them. He would scribble them. He would make really rude remarks about the people the books were describing. For example, he read a book by Reynolds, the founder of the Royal Academy. And in it he scribbled about Reynolds, "This man was born to depress art." He also read a book by Lavater. Lavater was a very popular author in his time. And in it, Lavater wrote, "Every genius, every hero is a prophet." Blake just underscored and underlined the word prophet. Prophecy was an enthusiasm for Blake, which cannot be underestimated. It was central to his view about how we should live our lives. William Blake's most important book, the one that contained the culmination of his life's work, was called Jerusalem. By chance, it's the same name as the popular hero. This book consists of 100 pages. Blake in his life never earned his living as an artist and as a poet. He earned his living in the trade that he was apprenticed to do. He was an engraver. And in the 18th century, engraving was a very important profession. It allowed the generation of wealth for publishers, because with an engraver, the publisher would give a painting or a drawing to the engraver, and the engraver would turn it into a copper plate. And with that copper plate, the image could be mass-produced. So one copper plate led to hundreds and hundreds of copies of something being made. So it's the beginning of the industrialization of art. It allowed proofs and prints to be sold in vast numbers. Blake thought that the culmination of his life's work, Jerusalem, would be a bestseller. It was 100 pages long, so he went to the trouble of engraving 100 copper plates, one for each page of the book. How many copies did he sell? This is not an answer you would know, but anyone who doesn't know the answer, have a guess. There's no reason you would know the answer. Five. That's a very mean answer. Any other suggestion?
27.
27.
26.
26.
25.
25.
What is impressive?
All of you are a bit on the low side, but actually he never sold a single copy.
So wait, I won.
He had one copy, which was his proof copy, which he showed to prospective publishers. And that one survives, and it's in America. The price on it is difficult to estimate, but it is an extraordinarily valuable item. The imagery of Jerusalem draws on one of the great sources of prophecy, and that is the Bible. Blake was a reader of the Bible. For him it was the most important, fascinating book. And the parts of it which really appealed to him were the writings of the prophets. And in the Bible there are many prophets, but the three books which William Blake read most often were Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the book of Revelation. So I've blown up one small part of the frontispiece to Jerusalem. If you just go back and go forward again so we can see the point. Please come in. So, we're taking this one small corner and blowing it up. And this strange image, halfway between a human figure, a figure with wings and eyes, it's described explicitly in the book of Revelation. It's verse 8, chapter 4. And so Blake is tying down the frontispiece to his book to one of the great prophetic books of the Bible. It's also a very beautiful image. And when if you look at the book of Revelation, you look for the wings, you look for the stars, you look for the two moon eyes, and they're all described in the book of Revelation. Another of his favorite authors was the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel spoke about wheels within wheels. He talked about visions. He talked about the Merkabah, the chariot, the throne. His vision of God on a chariot which was a form of throne. How Blake depicts this chariot is extraordinary and breaks most of the rules of how you depict things. Like, I often think that if Blake wasn't working for himself, if he was working for an editor, and he sent this image off to the editor, an editor would correct punctuation and text and spelling. If he came to look at this image, there is nothing correct about this image. The wheels of the chariot are made of a snake. The snake has 3 heads. Presumably there are 2 wheels, but they share 3 heads. The animal driving the chariot is a composite of a human, a horned animal, a hoofed animal. On the back, you have 2 eagle devils. And the ends of the horns turn into hands. And the driver, the 2 drivers of this chariot, they both appear to be fast asleep. So as an image, was Blake making many mistakes, or was he deliberately trying to subvert how we read an image? Because how you subvert an image has something to do with his understanding of prophecy. The Bible, as I said, is one of the great sources of prophecy. People look to it for examples of prophecy, of Jeremiah, of Ezekiel and Isaiah. The Bible is also the source of the Christian gospel. And in 1701, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was founded in England, part of the Anglican Church. It was set up initially to spread the word of the gospel to North America. This is its logo. It's a ship sailing off to the American colonies. The mission of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which still exists today, it's changed its name a couple of times recently. It's now called US, the United Society, US. It changed its name last year, and that was partly because it received a lot of bad publicity in 2007, when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, felt necessary to apologise for the past activities of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Early on in the late 18th century, a person left some valuable property to the Society. It consisted of a plantation in Barbados, a plantation with slaves. The Society took it over. It was a wonderful investment, and they ran it as efficiently as they knew how. And one of the things they had to deal with were their workforce, who were slaves. And in order to inhibit slaves from running away, they would brand the slaves. And the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel would brand the slaves on their chests with this name. And the Archbishop of Canterbury thought it was inconsistent for a Bible society to be branding their slaves with this name. It sounds funny a little bit, but it is a horrific example of how slavery was so accepted in that period, and how people could take the Holy Bible and interpret it in such a way. There is a phrase from the Bible again, Corinthians, St. Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, when he says, "The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life." Again, this is something to do with prophecy. St. Paul is making the comment that so often we retreat to observing the letter of the law, rather than letting the Spirit guide us. And in the case of the Society for the Propagation of the Bible, this has an ironic sense, because the actual letters they were branding, they were so rigid to their view of the world that this is what they were doing. Before I come to talking about how William Blake looked at prophecy, I want to say a little bit about how prophecy was a part of Blake's period. There were prophets arising in the cities, and indeed all over England. Two of the most important and well-known in Blake's time were Richard Brothers and Joanna Southcott. Richard Brothers began with a conventional career in the Navy, and then he started having visions. He started to believe that he was a prophet. And he, as most prophets, he gave pronouncements, and they became more and more subversive of authority, because one of the roles of a prophet is to challenge authority. It is in some sense a conventional meaning of prophecy is when the divine rule comes in conflict with what is actually being practiced. When people are being branded, then it is time for prophets to speak out. William Blake was part of the strong movement to abolish the slave trade. Richard Brothers eventually went a step too far, and he suggested in printed documents that the king, George III, should surrender his power two Richard brothers. He was locked up for about 15 years in an asylum. Many of his followers moved to another prophet, Joanna Southcott. Joanna Southcott was born about 1750 in the West Country. She spent her early years in Exeter. She was a simple, humble person. Rather like Blake, she earned her living with her hands. She was an upholsteress. But she loved stories, and she began writing down things that she heard in her head. And she began to attract a following. People who thought that what Joanna Southcott was saying was truly important, that she was a figure that should be listened to. She was a prophetess. After Brothers was incarcerated for insanity, the followers of him invited Joanna Southcott to London. And this was the beginning of how she became incredibly famous in London, far more famous than William Blake ever was. She was a good marketeer. Everyone who joined her following was given a sealed sign. It was a piece of paper, a token, that was sealed and contained a message. She did things which today we would identify as good publicity generation. One of them was she put into a wooden box an important prophecy. The box was sealed, and it could only be opened at a time of national emergency, and only then if 32 bishops of the Church of England were in attendance. The bishops refused to attend. The box still survives, and Joanna Southcott's descendants are known as the Panacea Society. They're still to be found in Bedford. There are very few of them, and they're reluctant to accept new devotees, partly because, like many dying societies, they are in possession of huge financial assets with very few members. So this box survives. I have to say there are several boxes which claim to be Joanna Southcott's box. But her main fame proclaimed was she believed the world would be put right by a female prophet. And she was that person. And when she was 64, she announced that she was pregnant. She had spent her life very carefully as a virgin, an unusual descriptor of oneself in that period of time. But she announced that she was pregnant, but pregnant in a very special way. The child she bore was Shiloh, and in the Bible, Shiloh is the second coming of Christ. So she did this outrageous thing. She announced that she was pregnant, and over 9 months, she became larger and larger. The pregnancy advanced. Her followers managed to get some very influential doctors to examine her. The Queen's own surgeon was convinced that she was pregnant. And then, as the 40 weeks termination approached, people became anxious. The baby had not been delivered. People were worried. Then she died. She was examined again, and the Queen's surgeon confirmed she thought she had been pregnant. Many of the Southcottian followers at this point moved away. They thought it wasn't true. But the true believers said, "You're interpreting this in too rational way that what really happened was the baby was delivered, but had been taken up to heaven very quickly. So Joanna Southcott was one example of very active prophecy in Blake's period. But she's using a form of prophecy which many people today, if you ask what does prophecy mean, most people would identify it with prediction. I prophesy that the royal baby will be born on a certain day. Or you predict the outcome of a football match. Okay? It becomes a very narrow definition, one of prediction. This has always been part of prophecy, but it's quite a limiting one. My favourite example of this was the Renaissance mathematician Cardanus, sometimes known as Cardan. He was one of the three great Renaissance figures. And in the same year that he published the great book on mathematics, Copernicus published his book about the rotation of the planetary system, and Vesalius published his book of anatomy. And in his day, Cardanus was considered an extraordinary mathematician. It was a time when things like the quadratic equation, which you may remember from your school if you're from England, or the cubic equation were being discovered. And if you remember from school days, the quadratic equation is a little bit of magic. You put in some numbers and out comes the answer. Cardan discovered the cubic equation. Again, you put in numbers and he could get the answer. He kept the equation secret because that part of prediction was really important. But why is he famous for prediction and prophecy? Because he gave a really important prediction. He said, I will die on this particular day. And then he committed suicide on that day. Now, that's a rather limiting view of prophecy. And it's not one Blake would approve of, because it is very much to do with reasoning. It's very rational. I make a prediction, it happens. He made it happen in quite a dramatic way, and he was absolutely right. But it's a narrow view of prophecy. At the core of Blake's view of the world was a term he used for himself called the ratio. And the ratio meant how we tend to limit our own lives through reasoning, and in particular the scientific reasoning, the inductive logic of science. He wasn't dismissive of science or of Newton, but he was critical of its place in our lives. What is inductive reasoning? It's when we say that the sun rose last week, it rose every day of the week, it'll rise again tomorrow. It's a very valuable, useful tool. If we look at the sun, today we think of it as a globe of gas which is being fueled by nuclear reactions. We don't look at the sun and think that it's a god or that it's a coin. We've narrowed down to one view of it. And the difficulty with inductive logic is it's incredibly powerful, but it robs us of the possibilities in areas which are not governed by reason to look at other possibilities. Now, this comes to Blake's definition, or Blake's view of what is prophecy. Prophecy is trying to shake you out of that complacency. It's trying to let you see other possibilities. And this is a definition by an academic scholar. It's quite dry, but it's quite interesting. Prophecy is there to accost the reader and to shake them out of two forms of understanding. One is about the external world, the society we live in, the rules that it imposes upon us. And another is the internal rules that we apply to ourselves. Blake had a term, the mind-forged manacles, the forms of chains that we impose upon ourselves. His books are quite complicated to read and to understand. But at their core, they are to do with these manacles. For example, one of his books is called The Visions of the Daughters of Albion. And at the core of the story, it's quite simple. It's a triangular relationship. A, B, and C. A loves B. B thinks he loves A. And along comes C. It's a dramatic story. So what happens is that A, B, and C rapes A. B, who professed love to A, cannot deal with it. The person he loved, in his view, is being corrupted. C, the rapist, accepts there are rules and there are laws. He's broken these rules. A moves out of these rules of society, the rules of monogamy, the rules of marriage, the rules of crime. And the rest of the book consists of each of the characters trying to untangle the mind-forged manacles that they've got themselves into. Now that last definition is something that Blake would not have liked at all. If you'd asked Blake, what is prophecy? He would have sidestepped the answer. He would have said, last night Isaiah and Ezekiel dined with me. This is a phrase from one of Blake's great books, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Blake would say this to people. I talked to Isaiah in the Strand. Isaiah and Ezekiel talked to me. I talked to them. We had a great conversation. One prophet to another. Now, science and reasoning was important to Blake. He wasn't totally dismissive of it at all. At the end of one of his books, he says, and sweet science reigns. The future is to be discovered through science. But he would use it in a way, he would try to use science in a way that it doesn't tie you down. It allows you to see more possibilities, not less. So we know that he read this book by Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke was one of the great scientists of Newton's period. And one of the things Robert Hooke did was he played with lenses. He played with microscopes, rather like Newton played with telescopes. And he published what he saw in books. So one of his great books was Micrography. It was what Hooke saw under his amazing new invention, the microscope. And he would turn it on objects which most of us are irritated about but maybe never see. For example, a flea. This is Robert Hooke's drawing of a flea. And you must remember, up to this time, you might have squashed one, but you never managed to see it in this detail. Now we know that William Blake saw this. And he himself painted a picture of a flea. But he wasn't going to be tied down by Robert Hooke. Is a flea a divine object? Next thing. This is Blake's famous image of a ghost of a flea. And it was the art historian Anthony Blunt, the one who was both an art historian and a spy, who first chased down the origin of this portrayal. So Blake is taking Robert Hooke's image of a flea, turning it into some humanoid form, and taking it a step further into a ghost, a spirit of a flea. Because for a prophet, you just can't accept what people impose upon you. You've got to challenge it. One of the primary ways that Blake tried to challenge the received wisdom that was imposed upon him was to do with manacles, to do with being chained, to do with being limited. In one of his great books, The Four Zoas, he asks the question, where shall we take our stand to view the infinite on the unbounded? How do you do that? How do you escape from the limitations imposed upon you by your friends, by your society, by your own psyche? And this was a question which accompanied him his whole life. And one answer for him was, execution is the chariot of genius. In order to ask questions, you have to have some skill you can execute. And for William Blake, it was to do with being an engraver, to being a poet, to being an artist. But he would also challenge people's idea of space and time. And again, commenting about the research into blood circulation, the research into physiology and anatomy that was surrounding Blake's lifetime, he would produce these comments about how he could create his own systems of space, his own systems of time. One of his most popular anthologized poems is To See the World in a Grain of Sand, and Heaven in a Wild Flower. To hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. So he was trying to challenge, as is the prophet's duty, how we fail to see, how we fail to break out of the impositions that is a grain of sand. dark? Does it not contain a whole world if we were only to look? How do we approach other people? What is the role of the prophet when we meet another person? Steve, how are you today?
Fine, thank you.
Okay. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you too.
How are you, Paige Morgan?
I'm all right.
These are all quite narrow answers. Sometimes, when I'm being a prophet, and people ask me, how am I say, not bad. But then I translate that. Not bad is an average. So other days I say, I'm somewhere between ecstasy and suicide. Now, ecstasy and suicide, I'm keeping those boundaries wide. If I simply say not bad, I've collapsed it down. A prophet, you have a duty to keep things open. When you approach another person, they're infinitely strange. What is this image? We have a figure which is a little bit like a cobra's head, sitting on a sunflower, floating on the ocean, a person who looks as if she's not bad today. It's an image that says, this person I am confronting is extraordinary. How do we do justice to it as a prophet? So what we're trying to do is resist the ratio, that imposition of reason. William Blake had a term for reason. He called it the spectre. The spectre was following him around all the time, saying, don't do that. Okay? Just modify, compromise. Don't say that I'm between ecstasy and suicide. Just say I'm okay. It's the ratio which inhibits what we might be doing. It also occurs within science, within some of the most rational parts of science, mathematics. About 100 years ago, there was a fashion in mathematics. Mathematics moves in fashion, like clothes and all sorts of things, where people were looking at numbers. It was mainly done in Germany by Frege. It was done in England by Bertrand Russell. They were looking at what is a number. If you ask yourself what is a number, it immediately becomes problematic. But eventually Frege got to an explanation of a number which was satisfactory to mathematicians. But then along came a man called Cantor, again in Germany, and he said, well, what about infinite numbers? And everyone said, well, you know, a number, if it's infinite, is infinite. And Cantor said, no, maybe we can have different infinite numbers. And people said, you're mad. Bertrand Russell said about Cantor that he was mad. He had immense problems with his university. Hilbert, David Hilbert, the greatest mathematician of his day, initially dismissed Cantor's work. But then he managed to show people, he managed to prove to mathematicians that you can have different infinities. More than that, he managed to produce an arithmetic of infinities. You add this infinity to that infinity, you get another infinity. You multiply the two together, and you get yet another. So Cantor was articulating something which everyone said don't go down that path, there's nothing to be found. And he said, no, I'm going into this grain of sand, and I'm going to show you that there's an infinite world inside this grain of sand. Just at the end of his life, Russell went to Germany and apologized. He got it wrong. So did David Heath. It was a little bit too late though. He'd had a hard life. Next slide. Playfulness is another way that a prophet deals with the rigidity we encounter. One of Blake's great books is Milton. I mentioned right at the beginning, Milton is where the hymn Jerusalem is to be found. Now Blake had a problem with Milton. Prophets are, they believe in themselves. And Blake knew that Milton had got it wrong. So, how do you correct someone who's dead? Well, you've got to bring them back. So, in the book Milton, Blake decided to bring back Milton. Milton, the great writer of the English Revolution, the great Republican. But Milton got it wrong about human relationships. And so Blake summoned Milton back, this great poet, the greatest of our English poets. And how did he bring him back? He brought him back as a shooting star. And Milton landed on Blake's left foot. So Blake brought Milton back as a shooting star and hit his left foot. A great entrance to a dramatic book. So you have to be playful. It's ultimately our responsibility, whether we see different infinite numbers, or whether we see a world in a grain of sand. How we are brought up, the rules that society imposes upon us, limit us. I doubt if there are many polygamists in this room tonight, because we observe the rule of marriage, that one can have just one legal partner. Many other cultures, that's not the case. You become what you see. So for Blake, it was really important to keep challenging what we see. When you look at another person, do you look at their kidney and their liver, their vocal cords? Do you look at their blood supply? We tend not to see these when we're talking to someone. We see the outer skin. Do you see their dreams? Do you see their aspirations? Do you see their poverty? Isn't poverty incredibly difficult to understand? I think all of us in this room are in probably the top 5% of the wealthiest people on the planet. Simply because that journalistic comment that most of the people on the planet live on less than $2 a day, is it? So all of us here, we're in that top percentile of the wealth of this planet. But do we think of ourselves as wealthy? I doubt it. Another thing Blake constantly does to try to pull the rug underneath you is the author's images. We have this peculiar image, which today in terms of graphic novels is not shocking at all. But when Blake was doing this in the beginning of the 1800s, people said William Blake was mad. Blake would use madness as another tool. How do you escape the conventions of society? Well, society allows you to be mad. They may lock you up, as with Richard Brothers, who believed that he should govern Britain rather than the king. But madness allows you to sidestep some of the conventions that limit us. And Blake would play this game of seeing things. Sometimes he was just being adolescent. He was being perverse. If he got bored of talking to someone, he would start to talk to the angel that was sitting on their shoulder. Now, in polite society, that is not acceptable. But it allowed to move people in a different direction. The prophet has this duty to challenge the rigidity we find ourselves in. He also made quite a profound comment that all that we see is the vision. We use an inductive shorthand. You see a red bird in a garden, it's a robin. Okay? The first time you see it, it's wow, it's wonderful. You then adopt a shorthand. A bird with a red colouring is a robin. And you stop looking at them. Blake's point was that we have a constant duty to understand that we are imposing what we see on what we see. And that it's our duty to look at things afresh. It's incredibly difficult to do. Habit is very comforting. The top quotation is from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell Again. And he's saying something that is to do with inequality. One doesn't have to treat people as equals. What one has to do, one's duty, is to honour the gifts that you encounter in another person. The Quaker George Fox said something very similar 2 centuries before, in a more polite form. Walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone. Meaning you ignore the rubbish that they impose upon you. You just talk to what is truly important in that person. And William Blake could be incredibly rude to people. He got a commission from Dr. Trussler to do a bit of work. Blake was really poor at this point, and it was really important to get some money. And a friend had recommended him to Dr. Trussler. He did this image. Dr. Trussler sent it back and said, "This is rubbish, this is mad." Did Blake apologise? No. He said this: "You ought to know that what is grand is necessarily obscure to weak men. That which can be made explicit to the idiot is not worth my care." Blake was not very politic. He was a prophet. Next slide. A word which is often attached to William Blake is the antinomian. Antinomian is a rare word. It means someone who challenges the accepted status quo at every possible level. And here we have an image from the end of Jerusalem, Blake's great book, where Blake's character of Albion is having a conversation with Jesus on the cross. It's a shocking image, even today. Albion is saying, having fun on the cross. Next image. This the Blake Society uses as one of its logos. It's an adaptation of that. Because joy is a final way of dealing with people. How can you be a prophet? Well, you don't let them depress you. You don't let them corrupt you. You don't let them chain you. What you do is you deal with them with joy. This is Blake's great figure of joy. This is the prophet. And earlier on, I talked about the book, The Visions of the Daughters of Albion. A, B, and C. C rapes A. A forgives C. A steps beyond the laws of marriage. A steps beyond the view that B had, that she had been corrupted. And A said, "Arise and drink your bliss, for everything that lives is holy." Thank you very much.
I was thinking as you were talking that there was a certain kind of certain parallels with Nietzsche, between Blake and Nietzsche. In as far as Nietzsche is also trying to deal with the question of how to look beyond reason and how to try and escape the straitjacket of reason. However, there's a certain kind of difference between Blake and Nietzsche, which you hinted at. That anyone familiar with Blake's kind of journalistic work or his poetry on kind of life in London would be familiar with, which is that there's a strong sense in which Blake lives through the French Revolution and he's acutely aware of kind of social injustice. Whereas Nietzsche is kind of takes the as his task to try and think beyond reason. He's also trying to think beyond equality, and he's also thinking, there's a certain sense in which equality itself is a straitjacket, and it denies difference and so on and so forth. Now that's something that I find personally quite horrifying. But nonetheless, you can see that there's a certain kind of point there, to the extent that if you're imposing a kind of social justice on the situation, then does that in any way contradict trying to think differently about situations? I don't know if that's clear. How do those two kind of values that Blake seems to hold, do they grate against each other? Do they contradict each other at all? Is he aware of this being a contradiction, or is it not?
Blake and Nietzsche is quite a big area of study, as I'm sure you know. The idea of undermining equality, thinking that equality is perhaps another straitjacket, I sort of touched on at the end when I was saying that what Blake was recommending was you look in a person for the gifts that they have, and you address yourself to those gifts. So I suppose that everyone has gifts. That would be a politically correct thing to say. But Blake would say that you are looking at those individual gifts in that person. You have no duty to look at lacunae, things they do not have. Blake and Nietzsche also shared something in common, something I didn't talk about William Blake, is that in Jerusalem, his great sublimation of all that he believed, he talks about the annihilation of the selfhood. Selfhood, a bit like Jung, although Blake precedes him by 2 centuries. And Nietzsche also shared something rather similar to that. So what Blake was suggesting was that one of the prisons that we find ourselves in is to do with the selfhood. And by managing to annihilate that, you reach a sense, a state where the world appears as it truly is. That the selfhood is a filter that robs you of seeing the world as it is. I don't think I've quite answered your question because Nietzsche is such a big subject.
And a big moustache too.
Sorry, Karen?
Yes, you can.
Well, yeah, I'll be brief. Yeah, I mean, well, that's certainly something which you mentioned a quote by George Fox, and that finding the God in everyone. I'm just not sure that a kind of, I guess I find it not necessarily a satisfactory resolution, just because I think that it has consequences politically. In as far as I think if you're choosing to go down, to dedicate your life to social justice and equality, then those are principles that you hold that brook no qualification at all. You know, there still seems to be a certain kind of sense in which someone has to have something in them in order to be considered worthy of equality.
Blake used the term creeping Jesus for people who gave a nod and to that idea of equality. He was dismissive of it because it's so easy to say that, you know, we're all equal, we're all special. It's far more dangerous to go against that common belief. It's a very safe belief. It's politically correct. What's difficult is maybe to go against it. And as a prophet, you have a duty to challenge it.
Okay. 2.
Number 2.
Yeah, possibly a simpler question. That you could probably have had that discussion for an hour or more and still be going around the edges of it. The Blake Society, what do you do? What's the function of it, the purpose of it? And a second question, maybe linked to that, is the ceramic pictures of Blake's paintings near Lambeth Bridge. Did you have any connection at all with having those put there in the railway tunnels near Lambeth Bridge? Which, if anybody doesn't know them, are fabulous and well worth going to see.
After the second one first, a member of the Blake Society set up this very wonderful organisation to help give people a skill, and the skill is making mosaics. And one of the sources for turning an image into a mosaic was Blake, because of his love of Blake. And because William Blake lived in Lambeth for 10 years, and his house was actually demolished, partly to do with slum clearances, but also to build some of the railways coming into London, that it did seem to be a good target to take these tunnels and passageways and turn them into mosaicked Blake worlds. I think some of them even have sound recordings that as you walk through them, it's triggered and Blake speaks to you. I'm not sure if that still goes, but I remember contributing something to it.
But certainly just walking through and looking at them, you can spend forever there, just one tunnel after another. I think there are 3 or 4 tunnels now. And they're just beautiful, they're stunning. In a grotty bit of London. And they're fabulous.
Grotty becomes a grotto, it is, yeah.
Interesting also because 100 years later, another divine draftsman ended up living in Lambeth for the rest of his life, and of course that was Austin Osman Spare.
But the society was the other one.
Yes. Your first question, the Blake Society. Well, answering it in a dry fact, it was set up in 1985. There have been previous organisations called a Blake Society, but when we look at them, there was one person calling themselves the Blake Society. It's gone through many fashions. When it was set up, it was founded by a generation of people who'd come out of the 30s and the Second World War, and they were radical people. They were setting out to change the world. And they were part of the CND movement. They were really politically radical people. I remember at one of my early committee meetings, the conversation turned towards arrest, imprisonment. And I was slightly shocked that the chairman, the first chairman of the Blake Society, he said that he'd been arrested 37 times. And I thought, this isn't what a chairman of an organisation that has become a charity should necessarily do. And of course I got it completely wrong. That generation was politically radical. It then turned into an organisation that was overtaken by academics. William Blake, rather like Shakespeare, is one of the staff of academies around the world. He's studied in most obscure places. For example, if you measure the academic interest in William Blake by the number of university papers that are published, number 1 is the United States, number 2 is England, and number 3 is where? You have to have a guess.
Japan.
Albania.
Russia. Brazil.
Japan. And it's odd because the Japanese sensibility doesn't appear obvious. Why take Blake? And then
he was a whack job and they're whack jobs.
Then after the academics, there was a period when craftspeople, artists, were very much influenced by Blake. My own personal interest is in buildings. William Blake lived in 9 properties in his lifetime, and of those 9, 7 have been demolished, which architectural historians will say is incredibly unlucky. Blake was an unlucky person, but to lose 7 out of the 9 is extraordinary. There are 2 that remain. He was a great Londoner, but he had this aberration around about 1800 when he thought he would go down to the south coast. And he stayed for 3 years in Felpham, which is next to Bognor Regis. At the time, this was under the threat of Napoleonic invasion. It was the most militarized zone in Europe. There were something like 100,000 troops on the south coast. It was like you and me going off to Baghdad for a holiday. It's just not sensible. And of course, Blake got arrested and he got tried for sedition because he accosted a soldier. He did get acquitted, but it shook him up a bit, and he returned to London. And the house he returned to is the London house that survives, the cottage in Felpham and the house in London. I often quip that Blake was a visionary in matters of real estate because the house in London is in Mayfair. It costs about £10 million.
3.
Yeah, fairly simple one. What's the situation with the gravestone? Is that what stage is that?
The project has been going on for almost 10 years. We hit great problems over planning permissions because Bunhill Fields is a Grade 1 listed environment. And to get permission to put a new gravestone there, we had to go through many levels of the City of London Corporation, besides Islington, besides central government. we've got all the permissions necessary to do it, and we just need to raise the money to do it. Part of the trick of getting permission was we went to the leading letter cutter in the country, Lida Cardoza. She's based in Cambridge. She's done all sorts of things from Westminster Abbey to Cambridge colleges to the British Library, the gates of the British Library. I don't know. She is rather expensive. So she gave us a great gift. We got permission because we used her. The penalty is that the cost of doing it is really quite a lot for a ledger stone. It's about £25,000 plus ancillary costs. So we're seeking to raise about £40,000 to do it, so that it's not just a stone, but we can use it to do something interesting. We could brand visitors with the Blake Society.
Just a couple of points of my own. The Panacea Society. The two of us, Kaya and myself, both worked at the Charity Commission, and I was there when there was a schism in the Panacea Society. They've been told you've really got to start spending money on charitable purposes rather than just owning buildings which are worth a fortune. And I had to deal with a complaint from one of the losing faction at the Panacea Society, because complaining they just spent £15,000 on buying wedding jewellery for a woman who was in the winning faction. And this wedding jewellery was to be put aside and kept safe until Jesus Christ returned to earth and this woman married him. Which we said, sorry, that's what you believe. That's what the majority of you believe. And they were starting to spend money on charitable causes, and were quite proud of it. The other one is that, of course, there's been a sort of popular cultural interest in William Blake that's spread across an awful lot. I've noticed a lot of people who are interested in Alistair Crowley become interested in William Blake, but I think the one who's dearest to my heart, who's I've met a few times, is Billy Bragg, who did an album called William Bloke, based upon his understanding of Blake. And the extent to which I think Blake was a Londoner is not something that has become, is not something that was very emphasised for a couple of centuries, but recently it has become very much part of the sort of new London interest, which is why there's a group called the online group called the Londonist, and why there are so many writers like Peter Ackroyd writing specifically about London as London, not simply as just a place where various things can happen. And William Blake seems to have become really central to that, perhaps because he was the first person who kind of wrote about London in that way. Would you agree?
Yes. One of the aspects of being a prophet that I didn't talk about is charm. It's to be a prophet. There's an element of charm involved in it. I remember the very first spiritualist seance I attended. The person who led the seance came up to me afterwards and said, "You're a lawyer." I was wearing a wig and tabs, that wasn't too difficult. But then she said, "One day you will write a great book on spiritualism." I never have, but it's an amazingly charming thing to say. The aspect about London and William Blake is really important. He is a London poet and an artist. He's a figure of the metropolis. When I say that Blake was charming, that many people adopt him. All sorts of people, like psychogeographers. There's a great movement of understanding London through places. He's the patron saint of lunatics. He's academics, writers, artists, the Crowley people. You know, he is found in almost everywhere. You open a book from the Tavistock Centre of Child Psychiatry, and there's William Blake. You meet astrophysicists, and you know, he's charming. He's everyone can adopt him. And part of that reason is an element of prophecy. Coming back to the Panacea Society, one of the good things is the Charity Commission said you just cannot sit on these assets. You've got to start distributing them. And so there have been, to my knowledge, beneficiaries. They've given a lot of money to academic research at Oxford on people doing work on maybe prophecy. They're a little bit narrow, you know. I've asked them, would they support something about prophecy? And no. But they're also interesting because all sorts of organizations, they start out and then they hit eventually this problem. You have a dying organization, your numbers are going down, but your assets are there. In America, the Shakers are a famous example. There are only a few left, I think. And you know, one of them said, I don't want to be remembered as a stick of furniture because Shaker furniture is so incredibly valued in America. They were a celibate organization, so they couldn't have children. So they're dying out. People join.
But the reason they're dying out now is that they increased their numbers by running orphanages. And they brought up their children within the movement who became the next generation of Shakers. And then the government took over orphanages as a state enterprise.
I was wondering where they came from. I imagine this 230-year-old bloke sitting on expensive furniture saying, I don't want to be remembered.
So no longer having orphanages, they no longer have the need.
And single parenthood and contraception, all those things do it. There are other organisations which are hitting this, like Conway Hall.
Yes.
Conway Hall, everyone knows it as this great venue. The organisation, the South Place Ethical Society, is a fascinating organisation which began in Blake's period, and it's over the period it's moved from a definite Christian sect to one which denied the Trinity, to one which denied a God. They had themselves a general secretary, Peter Cadogan, who was the first chair of the Blake Society. And he had a problem with the Charity Commission. He wanted the South Place Ethical Society and Conway Hall not to be an educational charity. The Charity Commission said, you can be an educational charity, no problem at all. He wanted it to be honest. They were a religious society that didn't believe in God. He took it to the High Court.
That's changed now because the 2005 Act finally changed it. Partly under pressure from myself and two people from the Pagan Federation to make sure it was belief in more than one God or belief in no God, because the Buddhists were hanging on a judgment by Lord Denning, who simply said, I can't tell these people that what they're doing isn't a religion. And the Jains, who are also an Indian religious sect, who are also atheists, were allowed to be charities because basically nobody in the Charity Commission except us, and we were keeping very quiet about it, actually knew that they were atheists.
So Peter Cadogan, this was in the 90s,
Yes.
he took this issue, which everyone thought was meaningless. There could be an educational charity, but he really believed it was important.
Yes.
You could be a religious society that didn't believe in God. He lost the case, a huge cost, and but the South Place Ethical Society continues. I remember him saying to me, Tim, you should join it so that when there are only 2 people left, you can dispose of the assets. Alas, there's still quite a number who are members, but they're sitting on Conway Hall.
Yeah.
And nowadays, what are they known for? It's a venue.
Yeah, here they're known as the place that the Pagan Federation meets at regularly.
Everyone meets there, but they've lost their purpose.
They still have, at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, their equivalent of Sunday church services, where speakers, I spoke there a few months ago, get up at 11 o'clock and speak to a room full of people.
It's in the library though, it's not in the main hall, isn't it?
It's sometimes in the main hall, it's a big speaker. I was in the side room.
Okay, before we go into
but it's strange how it is a replacement for religion in some ways.
Yes.
But they are getting very elderly.
Can I ask, please, for another round of applause for Tim Heath?